Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the Transport Minister said that ScotRail had learned the lessons from the chaos that passengers have endured. But in yesterday's statement, he left a series of questions unanswered. He says that ScotRail is well underway to implementing 250 action points for improvement, but he won't tell anyone what they are. And it's not for the first time. A month ago, he told MSPs on a parliamentary committee that he would come back to them with an answer. Yesterday, when asked again, he had nothing more to say. So can the First Minister give a commitment today? Will her government publish those 250 action points or not?
First Minister.
Yes, ScotRail will publish them within the next few days.
Ruth Davidson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, and I appreciate the clarity. I think, of course, it would have been better if the Transport Minister had been able to give the same clarity yesterday. But as we're making progress, let's keep it going. Let's keep this progress going, First Minister. We're told that there are 250 action points, but we're not going to be told, well, we want to be told when they're coming. Let's look at another point on timing. Told that work is well underway to deliver them. How can we judge that when yesterday, when asked, the Transport Secretary ducked the question on timescale? The public want to know when things will get better. So we asked yesterday, no answer from the Transport Minister. You've given me one answer today that he couldn't answer yesterday. Let's go for 2 out of 2. What is the deadline for these improvements? Can you today give us the answer that your Transport Minister couldn't yesterday?
First Minister.
These improvements cover a period of time. There is a summary of all of these action points that is already on ScotRail's website that any member of the Chamber, any member of the public indeed, can read. The full detail of each of the 246, to be precise, action points will, as I say, be published over the next few days. Now, what they cover are improvements to infrastructure, improvements to the ScotRail fleet and improvements to operations. And of course, all of this is backed by an investment of £5 billion over the remainder of this decade in improving our rail services. But in terms of the timescale, Humza Yousaf made it very clear yesterday that what we are doing, pressing ScotRail to deliver, are ongoing improvements to their performance. The contract that is in place right now targets ScotRail with making sure that 91 out of every 100 trains run within the recognised industry standard for punctuality. At the moment, their performance is 89 out of 100. That is not good enough. So the various action points that are covered in this plan are about improving that service and beginning to see improvements in that service immediately. And I think we should all get behind the Transport Minister as he seeks to do that.
Ruth Davidson.
And we were doing so well. So now we've got a government that is only now a month on starting to reveal the improvement plan that a month ago it said it would get on with doing so. But it also this week floated an alternative plan. And it raised the question of a public sector operator running the rail system. We need to ensure that any of these options are realistic. So can the First Minister tell the Chamber what is the earliest that such an operator could take over a rail system? And if, as the Transport Minister says, the rail network isn't a poor service, why does she think it's necessary?
First Minister.
Well, we had a commitment in our manifesto to make sure there was an option. We haven't had the powers to do this previously, but we will now have the powers. So we said we would make sure there was an option when the franchise is next up for renewal to ensure that there is a public service bid able to compete for that franchise. Now, I know the Tories are no friend of the public sector. Privatisation is and always has been the watchword of the Tories, but we want to make sure that there is a public service bid able to compete the next time the franchise comes up for renewal. The earliest that could be, as the member is aware, is 2022, and we will start making plans now to ensure that that is possible. That's why Humza Yousaf, as he said in this chamber yesterday, has invited all of the transport spokespersons from all of the parties to a meeting to start talking about how that can be delivered. I would hope that is something all people across this chamber would welcome, and it's yet more evidence of the action this government is taking to improve our railways.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, even the First Minister would admit that this week the rail network's been in a shambles. Commuters standing on platforms have watched as the Scottish Government has blamed the train operator for the mess, And the train operator has said that the Scottish Government is responsible for how many seats are available and therefore how much overcrowding exists. The contract has at least 6 more years to run. And the question that passengers want an answer to is pretty simple. When they've seen the events of the last week, over the next 6 years, how can they have any confidence at all that this deal is going to work?
First Minister.
Firstly, in terms of capacity in our railways, we are working towards plans that will deliver 200 new services, 20,000 more seats per day and better journey times. That's what we're purchasing with the £5 billion of investment that we're putting into our railways. And I should say that I think about 60% of the cost of running our railways in Scotland comes from government funding. That compares to about 20% south of the border. And while performance on our railways right now, as I have said, as the Transport Minister has said, is not as good as we want it to be, and we are determined to see it improve, the performance of the trains in Scotland is slightly better than the GB average. So we take our responsibilities seriously, and I would think it is better for all members across this chamber to back the Transport Minister as he works to make sure that ScotRail is delivering the standard of service that the travelling public have a right to expect.
Question number 2, Kezia Dugdale.
Do you ask the First Minister what engagement she has planned for the rest of the week?
First Minister.
Among other things, I will be in Cardiff tomorrow for a meeting of the British-Irish Council.
Kezia Dugdale.
Today, there was more delay and disruption on Scotland's rail network. At one stage this morning, 1/3 of trains were running late. Yet again, thousands of people were delayed getting to work. But earlier this week, the Transport Minister, Humza Yousaf, said it isn't a poor service. And in her answers to Ruth Davidson, the First Minister did what her government always does. She blames Labour and then talked about England. Does she really think that the thousands of people delayed at Glasgow Central today care what happened in 2002 or what's going on in Cornwall this morning?
First Minister.
Well, I am not particularly interested in what's going on in Cornwall this morning. I am very interested in what's going on in Scotland. And what has happened this morning, as members are aware, there has been a points failure affecting services to and from Glasgow Central. That failure has now been rectified. Now, I regret any delay and any disruption, and as I said last week, we apologise to anybody whose train was delayed because of that points failure. Unfortunately, these kinds of things do happen on our railways, and what is important is that ScotRail communicates properly with the travelling public, and that we make sure that the investments in our rail infrastructure to reduce the chances of these things happening in future. That's why the investment plan in operations, in infrastructure, in fleet are so important. So we will continue to take our responsibilities seriously. When I talk about performance under Labour, I'm not suggesting that that should in any way excuse poorer performance right now, but I simply put it we simply do that to put today's performance into context. So for the most recent period, the performance of ScotRail was 89.8%. It should be higher than that. But that is higher than in any one of the years under the last Labour administration. I say that simply to put it into context. So we will continue to make the investments and do the work necessary to improve our rail services. I think that is what the travelling public have a right to expect from us.
Kezia Dugdale.
I'm sure that was of great comfort to the people stranded on platforms this morning. But I am glad that the First Minister agrees with me that the service Scotland's commuters are receiving just isn't good enough, and that the First Minister thinks that passengers deserve better. Because in January, the price of regulated rail fares is due to rise. A passenger using an annual season ticket to travel between Edinburgh and Glasgow will have to pay £71 more next year. And that makes people even angrier. I think passengers deserve a break. And that's why today Labour is publishing a plan to freeze all regulated rail fares next year. Surely the First Minister agrees with us. Surely the First Minister agrees with us that people deserve a break. She has the power to give them one. So will she back Labour's call for a 2017 rail fare freeze?
First Minister.
Of course, we will consider any proposal that is put forward. We will particularly look to see how that proposal is being paid for, because we have an investment package that I have spoken about that it is important we are able to implement and deliver. Of course, we do not want to see rail fares increase any more than is absolutely necessary. That's why we at the moment have increases in rail fares that are at their lowest level since powers over railway were devolved to this Parliament since 2005. We see peak time rail fare increases limited to inflation. Off-peak rail fare increases are actually limited to inflation minus 1%. So that is the discipline we exert on rail fares. We will consider any proposals, but above all else, we will make sure we have fairness around the funding of our railways so that we can carry out the investments that are required to make sure that standards do improve on our railways.
Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, President Officer. This is a serious proposal with means to pay for it contained within, and we asked the Scottish Parliament's independent experts to cost it for us. And they have estimated that it would cost as little as £2 million. Now, that's the equivalent of 2 months' profit, 2 months of a Bellio profit. People are fed up with expensive, overcrowded and unreliable trains. And the SNP are desperate to talk tough about what action they might take in 2022. But passengers left stranded on freezing platforms this morning need a break now. So doesn't the First Minister agree with me that after weeks of misery, passengers in Scotland deserve to know that there is light at the end of the tunnel with a fare freeze in 2017?
First Minister.
Firstly, I've said we'll look at any proposal that is put forward, and I will stick to that commitment. But we've also been bearing down on rail fare increases already. As I said to Ruth Davidson, a much bigger proportion of the funding of our railways in Scotland comes from government funding as opposed to rail fares than is the case south of the border, and I think that is right and proper. But we will also make sure we plan the investment that is required to improve the infrastructure, to improve the trains and to improve the operation of our trains so that the kind of delays we are talking about just now are not seen in the future. That's the responsible action we will continue to take, and I think that is the action the travelling public have a right to expect. Yes, we will look at the option of a public service bid in future, but right now we will continue to focus on making the improvements that people want to see.